I'm glad you could join us. Go ahead and stab the like button and stick around for the next untold story. Matt had never been much of a gym goer. He preferred the outdoors, running along trails and hiking through the woods. But after a knee injury sidelined him, he decided to take his doctor's advice and start working out indoors. His physical therapist recommended a small, 24-hour gym a few miles from his apartment, known for its quiet atmosphere and well-maintained equipment. The gym, called Iron Haven, was located in an old brick building on the edge of town. It was a no-frills kind of place, with weights that clanked loudly, machines that looked like they belonged in the 1980s, and a clientele that mostly consisted of serious lifters and the occasional night owl. Matt, who worked late hours as a bartender, found the gym's 24/7 accessibility convenient. He often went after his shifts, arriving around 2 or 3 in the morning when the gym was nearly deserted. For the first few weeks, his routine was uneventful. He'd arrive, swipe his key card at the front door, and spend an hour or so lifting weights, doing some cardio, and stretching. The only other people he saw during those hours were a couple of regulars, an older man with a graying beard who always wore the same faded hoodie, and a young woman who kept to herself, her headphones firmly in place as she pounded out miles on the treadmill. But one night, things started to feel different. Matt arrived at the gym later than usual, closer to 3:30 a.m. The air outside was thick with fog, and the streets were eerily quiet. When he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed that the gym's windows were dark, the usual fluorescent glow absent. He swiped his key card at the door, and after a brief pause, the lock clicked open. The interior lights flickered to life as he stepped inside, but the gym felt colder than usual, the air heavy with a strange metallic smell. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder, more insistent, and the clanging of weights in the distance echoed through the empty space. Matt shook off his unease and headed to the locker room to change. The room was silent, except for the faint dripping of a faucet somewhere in the back. He changed quickly, the sound of his own breathing unnervingly loud in the stillness. As he walked out into the main gym area, he noticed something odd. The older man and the young woman weren't there. They were usually the only other people at the gym this late, but tonight the place was deserted. Matt shrugged it off and started his workout, but as he moved through his routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The metallic smell persisted, stronger near the free weights, and the air felt thicker, almost suffocating. He chalked it up to fatigue, telling himself that he was just tired from his shift. After finishing his sets on the bench press, Matt moved to the squat rack. As he loaded the bar with weights, he heard a soft, rhythmic thudding sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it cut through the silence of the empty gym like a knife. He paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Shrugging it off, Matt resumed his workout, focusing on his form. But as he pushed through his squats, the thudding returned, louder this time, coming from somewhere near the back of the gym. Matt racked the bar and turned toward the sound, his heart starting to race. The gym was empty, as far as he could tell, but the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, pooling in the corners of the room and creeping along the floor. He walked toward the source of the noise, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The thudding grew louder, more rhythmic, like the pounding of a distant drum. It seemed to be coming from the farthest corner of the gym, near the heavy bags in the back exit. As Matt approached, the metallic smell intensified, filling his nostrils with a nauseating tang. The thudding was louder now, almost like the sound of a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. He reached the corner and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the shadows, was a figure, a man standing perfectly still, facing the heavy bag. His back was to Matt, but something about his posture was unsettling. The man was tall, his shoulders hunched forward, his head tilted slightly to the side. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, obscuring his face. The thudding sound was coming from the heavy bag, which was swinging back and forth as if it had just been hit, but the man hadn't moved. He just stood there, staring at the bag, his hands at his sides. Matt took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey," he called out, his voice shaky. "You okay?" The man didn't respond, didn't turn around. The heavy bag continued to sway, the thudding sound growing louder, more insistent. Matt felt a chill run down his spine. he had the sudden, irrational urge to leave, to run out of the gym and never look back. But something kept him rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread. He took another step forward, trying to get a better look at the man's face. "Hey man," Matt said, his voice firmer this time. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man finally moved, slowly turning his head to look over his shoulder. Matt's breath caught in his throat as the man's face came into view, illuminated by the dim overhead lights. The man's skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, hollow and lifeless. His lips were cracked and dry, twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't reach his eyes. But what struck Matt the most was the man's expression. There was something unnervingly familiar about it, as if he recognized Matt, as if they had met before. The thudding sound reached a deafening crescendo, and the heavy bag suddenly stopped swinging, hanging still and silent in the air. The man's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth, and he took a step toward Matt. Panic surged through Matt, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The man took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his hollow eyes locked onto Matt's. Without thinking, Matt turned and ran, sprinting across the gym floor toward the front exit. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, the sound of the thudding heartbeat following him, growing louder and faster with each step. He reached the front door and yanked it open, nearly tearing it off its hinges. The cold night air hit him like a wall, but he didn't stop. He ran to his car, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely unlock the door. He jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. The gym's lights flickered ominously as he backed out of the parking lot, the dark windows staring back at him like empty eyes. As he sped away, Matt glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the parking lot, watching him leave. But there was nothing, just the fog rolling in from the streets and the empty road behind him. When he finally reached his apartment, Matt locked the door behind him and collapsed on the couch, his heart still racing. He couldn't shake the image of the man's face, that twisted smile, those lifeless eyes. He told himself it was just some crazy guy, some late-night gym-goer who had lost it. But deep down, he knew it was something more. There was no rational explanation for what he had seen, no way to make sense of the fear that still gripped him. That night, Matt lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, heard the thudding sound echoing in his ears. The gym had been his sanctuary, a place to find peace and focus, but now it was tainted, twisted into something dark and malevolent. He knew he couldn't go back, not after what he had experienced. But the thought of never returning, of leaving it behind, filled him with an inexplicable dread. It was as if the gym had reached out and touched something deep inside him, something he couldn't escape. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Matt finally drifted off to sleep. But even in his dreams, the man was there, standing in the shadows, smiling that twisted, hollow smile. And the thudding continued, louder and louder, the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Matt's sleep was plagued with nightmares that felt too real. In every dream, he found himself back in that dimly lit gym, surrounded by the thudding sound that grew louder and more menacing with each passing second. The man was always there, lurking in the shadows, his lifeless eyes fixed on Matt, his smile twisted into something that made Matt's skin crawl. When Matt woke the next morning, drenched in sweat, he was convinced it had all been a nightmare. It had to be. He told himself that the late hour, fatigue, and the eerie emptiness of the gym had played tricks on his mind. But as he went about his day, the feeling of dread clung to him like a shadow. No matter how hard he tried to shake it, the image of that man, that unnatural grin, stayed with him. For the next few days, Matt avoided the gym. He made excuses, telling himself he needed a break, that he could work out at home or find another gym in town. But deep down, he knew he was terrified of what he might encounter if he went back. The memory of that night haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Then, one night, as Matt sat in his apartment, trying to distract himself with mindless television, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a notification from the gym's app, a reminder that he hadn't checked in for several days. But it was the message that appeared beneath the reminder that made his blood run cold. Your session is scheduled for 3 a.m. See you soon. Matt's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't scheduled any session. In fact, he'd been doing everything possible to avoid going back. The message was unsettlingly specific, and it felt like a direct challenge. The man from the gym, the one who had appeared out of nowhere, was somehow connected to this. But how and why? Trying to calm himself, Matt told himself it was a mistake, a glitch in the app. But the unease wouldn't leave him. He knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he figured out what was going on. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay away, he decided to return to the gym one last time, if only to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his mind. At 2:45 a.m., Matt arrived at the gym. The parking lot was empty, and the fog that had rolled in from the night before seemed thicker than ever. He sat in his car for a few minutes, staring at the darkened building, steeling himself for whatever might be inside. Finally, he gathered his courage, grabbed his bag, and stepped out into the cold night air. As he approached the gym's entrance, his hands shook. He swiped his keycard at the door, and after a brief pause, the lock clicked open. The lights flickered on as he stepped inside, but the air felt heavy and oppressive, the metallic smell from before still lingering. The gym was eerily quiet, the hum of the overhead lights louder than ever. Matt set his bag down on a bench, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The machines were empty, the free weights undisturbed, but that didn't bring him any comfort. The memory of the man's lifeless eyes and that twisted grin sent shivers down his spine. He walked slowly through the gym, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Everything looked normal, but the unease gnawing at his gut only intensified. He reached the corner where the heavy bags were hung and stopped dead in his tracks. The man was there, standing exactly where Matt had seen him before. His back was to Matt, but his posture was the same, hunched forward, head slightly tilted. The heavy bag swayed back and forth as if it had just been struck, though the man's hands remained at his sides. Matt's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt like lead. For a long moment, he just stood there, paralyzed with fear, staring at the man's back. Then, slowly, the man began to turn. Matt's pulse quickened as the man's face came into view, pale, expressionless, the same hollow eyes, the same twisted smile. But this time, something was different. The man's mouth began to move, but instead of speaking, he emitted a low, guttural sound, like the distant rumble of thunder. The lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the gym. The man took a step toward Matt, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if he was a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The thudding sound returned, louder than ever, pulsing in time with Matt's racing heartbeat. Matt stumbled backward, tripping over a dumbbell and nearly falling. His mind screamed at him to get out, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The man was getting closer, his grin widening unnaturally, stretching across his face in a way that no human face should be able to move. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the man was right in front of Matt, his face inches from Matt's own. The thudding was deafening now, drowning out everything else, and Matt felt as though his head would explode from the pressure. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, as the man reached out a hand and placed it on Matt's chest. The touch was icy cold, and Matt felt a jolt of pain shoot through his body, as if something had pierced his heart. The man's grin stretched impossibly wide, his eyes locking onto Matt's with an intensity that made him feel as though he was being sucked into a void. The last thing Matt saw before the darkness claimed him was the man's face, twisted and distorted, grinning down at him with that horrifying smile. The thudding reached a crescendo, and Matt felt himself falling, sinking into an abyss of cold and darkness. When the gym staff arrived the next morning, they found Matt's car still in the parking lot, but he was nowhere to be found. His gym bag was still on the bench where he'd left it, and the lights in the gym flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows across the room. The security footage showed nothing unusual, just Matt entering the gym and beginning his workout. But after 3 a.m., the cameras malfunctioned, the footage turning to static for several minutes before resuming. By the time the cameras came back online, Matt was gone. Despite an extensive search, Matt was never found. The gym staff, unnerved by the strange events, began to notice odd occurrences, lights flickering, the faint sound of a heartbeat echoing through the gym late at night, and the occasional sighting of a tall, shadowy figure standing in the corner near the heavy bags. Word of Matt's disappearance spread, and soon, the late-night regulars began to dwindle. Those who continued to work out at the gym after dark reported a growing sense of unease, as if they were being watched. Some claimed to have seen a man with a twisted smile standing in the shadows, his hollow eyes following them as they moved through the gym. Eventually, the gym closed down, unable to shake the stigma of what had happened. The building was left abandoned, its windows dark, its doors chained shut. But those who lived nearby would sometimes hear strange noises coming from inside, soft, rhythmic thudding, like the sound of a heartbeat and the distant echo of a man's laughter. And on certain nights, when the fog rolled in thick and the streets were silent, they swore they could see a figure standing in the gym's window, grinning down at them with hollow, lifeless eyes. After years of neglecting his fitness, Greg finally decided it was time to make a change. He signed up for a membership at a 24-hour gym, the kind that was open all night for people with odd schedules. Greg worked late shifts as a security guard, and by the time he clocked out, most gyms were closed. This one, however, was always open, and he liked the idea of working out when it was quiet and nearly empty. The gym was located on the outskirts of town, tucked away in an old industrial building. It wasn't the flashiest place, just the basics: free weights, a few machines, and a couple of treadmills. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, and the walls were lined with mirrors that seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the old building. Despite its rundown appearance, it had everything Greg needed. He quickly settled into a routine. After work, he'd head straight to the gym, arriving around 1 o'clock or 2 a.m. It was usually deserted, which suited him just fine. He liked the solitude, the way the clank of weights and the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the treadmill were the only sounds in the vast, empty space. But after a few weeks, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, just little things that Greg could easily brush off. He'd catch a glimpse of movement in the mirrors out of the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. Sometimes he'd hear faint noises, like the sound of footsteps on the rubberized floor. But when he stopped to listen, the gym was silent. One night, after finishing his workout, Greg sat down on a bench to catch his breath. He was alone, as usual, the gym eerily quiet except for the distant hum of the HVAC system. As he wiped the sweat from his face, he glanced up at the mirrors and felt his heart skip a beat. In the reflection, just beyond the row of treadmills, he saw someone standing there, still and silent, almost blending into the shadows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Greg could sense that the man was staring directly at him. Greg whipped around, but the gym was empty. His pulse quickened as he scanned the room, his eyes darting from one corner to another. He was sure he had seen someone. The mirrors didn't lie, did they? He stood up, his body tense, and walked toward the spot where he'd seen the figure. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. But there was no one there, just the dim light casting long shadows on the floor. Greg told himself he was just tired, that his mind was playing tricks on him after a long shift. But the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling at the back of his neck. He hurried through the rest of his workout, unable to shake the unease that had settled over him. As he left the gym that night, the parking lot seemed darker than usual, the streetlights flickering weakly. Greg walked quickly to his car, glancing over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone following him. But the lot was empty, just like the gym. The next night, Greg almost didn't go. He considered skipping his workout, telling himself he could afford to take a night off, but he didn't want to give in to irrational fear. It was just his imagination, he told himself. There was nothing to be afraid of. When he arrived at the gym, it was as deserted as always. He swiped his card, pushed open the door, and walked in. The air was cool, the lights bright, but the place felt wrong somehow. The mirrors seemed to reflect the light differently, casting the room in a strange, almost unreal glow. Greg tried to ignore the feeling, focusing on his workout instead. He started with the bench press, loading the bar with weights and lying back on the bench. As he pushed through his sets, the familiar rhythm of the lift and the clang of the weights helped ease his mind. But as he finished his last set, he felt a cold draft brush across his face, as if someone had walked past him. He sat up quickly, looking around, but the gym was empty. The unease was back, stronger this time. Greg wiped the sweat from his forehead, his heart beating faster. He glanced at the mirrors again, scanning them for any sign of movement, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Trying to shake off the fear, he moved to the squat rack. As he loaded the bar, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound. It was coming from somewhere behind him, near the row of treadmills. Greg froze, the sound sending a shiver down his spine. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. The treadmills were off, their displays dark, the belts still. The thumping continued, growing louder, closer. Greg's breath caught in his throat. There, at the far end of the gym, near the heavy bags, he saw the man again, the same figure in the dark hoodie. He was facing the wall, his back to Greg, his body completely still. But there was something wrong with the way he stood, as if his limbs were too stiff, his posture unnatural. The thumping sound was coming from the man, echoing through the gym, growing louder and more insistent. Greg's mouth went dry, fear coiling in his gut. The man didn't move, didn't turn around, but the sense of being watched intensified. Greg wanted to leave, to run out of the gym and never come back, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It was like a nightmare, the kind where you know you should run, but your legs won't obey. The air grew colder, the metallic smell from before now overpowering, as if the very atmosphere was turning against him. Finally, the man moved. His head tilted slightly, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned around. Greg's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The man's face was still obscured by the hood, but as he stepped forward, the dim light caught his features. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, hollow and empty. His lips were curled into a twisted smile, a grin that didn't belong on a living face. The thumping grew louder, reverberating through Greg's skull, drowning out all other sounds. The man took another step toward him, his movements slow, almost mechanical. Greg could see now that the man's limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, as if his bones were stretched out of proportion. Panic surged through Greg. He backed away, stumbling over a dumbbell and nearly falling. The man kept advancing, his smile widening, his eyes locked onto Greg's with a gaze that seemed to pierce through him. "Stay back!" Greg shouted, his voice trembling. But the man didn't stop. The thumping sound was all Greg could hear now, growing louder, faster, like a heartbeat out of control. The man's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, his hollow eyes boring into Greg's soul. Greg's vision blurred, his head spinning as the sound grew deafening. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. In a last desperate act, Greg turned and ran. He bolted for the door, his legs pumping as fast as they could, the thumping sound pounding in his ears. He could feel the man behind him, could feel those hollow eyes watching him, that twisted smile chasing him through the darkened gym. He reached the door, slammed it open, and burst out into the night. The cold air hit him like a wall, but he didn't stop. He ran to his car, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart racing with fear. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely unlock the door. Finally, he got in, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. He didn't look back as he sped out of the parking lot, the gym's dark windows disappearing in the rearview mirror. But the fear didn't leave him. Even as he drove through the empty streets, his heart still pounding, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still there, still watching him. When Greg finally reached his apartment, he rushed inside and locked the door behind him. He collapsed onto the couch, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But even in the safety of his home, the thumping sound echoed in his ears, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. Greg didn't return to the gym after that night. He canceled his membership, told himself he would find another place to work out, but the memory of the man in the hoodie haunted him. He started hearing the thumping sound at odd times, while he was at work, while he was trying to sleep, even in the middle of conversations. It was always there, always lurking in the background, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. He'd see the man in the hoodie, standing in the corner of his room, that twisted smile spreading across his face as he watched Greg with those hollow eyes. The thumping would grow louder, faster, until it felt like his skull would burst. Greg's life began to unravel. He couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting for him. The fear consumed him, and he started to withdraw from everything and everyone, too scared to go out, too scared to be alone. And then, one night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard it again, the thumping, louder than ever, coming from just outside his apartment door. Greg's heart raced, his body frozen with fear. The sound grew louder, closer until it was right outside his door, pounding in time with his own heartbeat. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but something compelled him to get up, to walk to the door. His hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob, the thumping now deafening, echoing through his entire body. He opened the door slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing in the hallway, was the man in the hoodie. His face was still obscured by shadows, but Greg could see the twisted smile, the hollow eyes watching him, the grin spreading wider as the thumping reached a crescendo. Greg tried to scream, but no sound came out. The man stepped forward, his grin stretching impossibly wide, his eyes locking onto Greg's with a gaze that burned into his soul. And then everything went black. The next morning, Greg's neighbors found his apartment door wide open. The place was empty, but the air inside was heavy with an oppressive silence. His belongings were undisturbed, his bed still made, but there was no sign of Greg. The only clue was the faint, rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to echo through the apartment, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Greg's disappearance left his friends and family in shock. The police investigation turned up nothing. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no clues at all. It was as if Greg had simply vanished into thin air. But those who knew him best could sense that something was terribly wrong. They remembered how paranoid he had become, how he had started talking about strange noises and the feeling of being watched. Yet, despite their best efforts, no one could explain what had happened to him. In the days that followed, Greg's apartment remained eerily quiet, untouched since the morning his neighbors found the door open. His friends tried to move on, but a shadow seemed to linger over everyone who had been close to him, a sense of dread that they couldn't shake. As time passed, strange rumors began to spread among those who knew Greg. People spoke in hushed tones about a figure in a dark hoodie that had been seen around town, always in the distance, always just out of sight. Some claimed to have heard a rhythmic thumping sound, like a heartbeat, that would follow them late at night. No one could explain it, but the stories all had the same unsettling detail. The figure would always appear near a mirror or a reflective surface, its hollow eyes fixed on whoever dared to look. Months went by, and the gym where Greg had his terrifying experience was abandoned, its doors chained shut. But even after it was closed, people reported seeing lights flicker inside at odd hours of the night, and those who walked past it would often hear the faint, rhythmic thumping coming from within. One night, Greg's best friend Mike, who had been increasingly troubled by Greg's disappearance, decided to investigate the gym himself. He had been haunted by the same nightmares that Greg had described, and the relentless thumping sound had started to plague his sleep as well. Mike was desperate for answers, even if it meant facing the terror that had claimed his friend. At midnight, Mike parked his car across the street from the gym and stared at the dark building. The windows were black, but every now and then, he thought he saw a flicker of light from deep inside. The air was cold and heavy, and the fog that clung to the ground made the night feel suffocating. Determined to find out the truth, Mike crossed the street and approached the gym's front door. The chain was still in place, but the padlock was missing. His heart pounded as he pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the gym was exactly as Greg had described, dim with flickering fluorescent lights that barely illuminated the old, dusty equipment. The air was thick with a metallic smell, and the mirrors lining the walls reflected the dim light in strange, distorted ways. Mike's breath fogged in the cold air as he stepped deeper into the gym. The place was silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. He walked past the rows of treadmills and weight machines, his footsteps echoing on the rubberized floor. Then he heard it. The rhythmic thumping sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the back of the gym, near the heavy bags, just as Greg had described. The sound sent a chill down his spine, but Mike forced himself to keep moving. He had to know what had happened to Greg. As he approached the heavy bags, the thumping grew louder, more insistent. Mike's heart raced, and he could feel the cold sweat on his forehead. He rounded the corner and froze. There, standing by the heavy bags, was the figure in the dark hoodie. Its back was to Mike, but he could see the outline of its tall, thin frame, the way its limbs seemed unnaturally long and stiff. The heavy bags swayed slightly, the source of the thumping, but the figure's hands hung limply at its sides. Mike's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly began to turn. It moved in the same jerky, mechanical way that Greg had described, its head tilting slightly as if listening to something only it could hear. When the figure finally faced him, Mike felt the blood drain from his face. The hood had fallen back, revealing a face that was wrong in every way. Its skin was pale and waxy, its eyes sunken and hollow, like deep pits of darkness. The twisted grin stretched across its face, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. But what horrified Mike the most was the sense of familiarity. The figure's face was a distorted, nightmarish version of Greg's own. The thumping sound intensified, echoing through Mike's skull, drowning out his thoughts. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen in place, his body paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step toward him, its grin widening even further, and Mike could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the same cold that Greg had described. The thumping grew deafening, matching the erratic beat of Mike's heart. As the figure reached out a hand, Mike finally found the strength to move. He turned and ran, sprinting through the gym, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure's footsteps echoed behind him, slow and deliberate, as if it knew Mike couldn't escape. He burst through the front door and stumbled into the foggy night. The cold air hit him like a wall, but he didn't stop. He ran to his car, nearly tripping over the curb in his panic, and fumbled with the keys as he tried to unlock the door. As he started the engine and sped away, Mike glanced in the rearview mirror. The gym was shrouded in fog, but for a brief moment, he saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching him leave. Its hollow eyes gleamed in the darkness, and the twisted grin was still plastered on its face. Mike drove aimlessly through the empty streets, his heart racing, his mind in turmoil. He couldn't go home, couldn't stop moving, not with that thing out there. The thumping sound still echoed in his ears, and he could feel the cold creeping into his bones, no matter how high he turned up the heat in the car. Hours passed, but the fear didn't fade. Mike knew that the figure, whatever it was, had followed him, that it would never stop. The same terror that had claimed Greg was now coming for him. He finally pulled over in a deserted parking lot and slumped over the steering wheel, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He closed his eyes, but the image of the figure, of that twisted, familiar face, was burned into his mind. And then in the silence of the night, he heard it again. The rhythmic thumping, faint but growing louder, coming from just outside the car. Mike's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing right behind the car, its hollow eyes locked onto him, the twisted grin stretching wider than ever. The thumping grew louder, faster, drowning out the sound of Mike's own heartbeat. He tried to start the car, but his hands were shaking too badly to grip the keys. The cold seeped through the windows, filling the car with a freezing mist that clung to his skin. The last thing Mike saw before the darkness closed in around him was the figure's face, pressed against the rear window, grinning at him with those lifeless eyes. When Mike's car was found the next morning, the engine was still running, but he was nowhere to be seen. The doors were locked, and there were no signs of a struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. The investigators who examined the car reported feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, and some claimed to have heard a faint, rhythmic thumping sound coming from the trunk, though nothing was ever found. The gym, now abandoned and shunned by the locals, became a place of whispered rumors and dark tales. People spoke of a figure in a dark hoodie that could be seen in the mirrors at night, a figure that looked disturbingly like the missing men. The building was eventually condemned, but those who passed by it at night still claimed to hear strange noises. The distant hum of the lights, the faint thudding of a heartbeat, and the sound of someone, or something, laughing in the dark. The story of Greg and Mike became a local legend, a warning to anyone who dared to visit the gym after dark. And those who did venture too close, who dared to look into the mirrors, would sometimes catch a glimpse of a tall, thin figure standing just behind them, grinning with hollow eyes that followed them wherever they went. Ben had always preferred working out late at night. There was something peaceful about the quiet hours when the world slept, and he had the gym all to himself. After a long day at the office, it was his way of unwinding, of releasing the stress that accumulated throughout the day. The gym he frequented was a small 24-hour facility located in a strip mall on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just the basics: a few treadmills, some free weights, and a couple of outdated machines. But it had everything Ben needed, and he liked the solitude that came with his late-night workouts. It was a Wednesday, just after midnight, when Ben pulled into the gym's empty parking lot. The fluorescent lights inside cast a harsh, sterile glow through the large front windows, and the familiar hum of the HVAC system was the only sound that greeted him as he stepped out of his car. He swiped his membership card at the door, and the lock clicked open with a soft beep. The air inside was cool, almost cold, and there was a faint smell of cleaning supplies mixed with the lingering scent of sweat and rubber mats. Ben dropped his gym bag on the nearest bench and headed toward the free weights. As usual, he was the only one there. The gym was silent, save for the hum of the lights and the distant whir of the fans. He started his routine with some light stretching, then moved on to the bench press. The bar felt solid in his hands, the familiar clank of the weights as he lifted them echoing through the empty room. Everything seemed normal at first, but as Ben settled into his workout, a strange sensation began to creep over him. It started as a slight prickling at the back of his neck, the kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you. He paused between sets, glancing around the gym, but there was no one else there. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to his imagination, and moved on to the leg press. But the sensation only grew stronger. He could feel eyes on him, though every time he looked up, the gym was as empty as ever. Ben decided to switch to the treadmill, hoping a change of pace would clear his mind. He climbed onto the machine, set it to a light jog, and began running. The rhythmic thump of his feet against the belt was comforting, but the unease lingered. As he ran, he glanced at the mirrored wall in front of him. The reflection showed the empty gym behind him, the rows of machines lined up like soldiers, the dumbbells neatly stacked on their racks. But then, something caught his eye. A figure, standing in the corner near the squat rack, barely visible in the dim light. It was just a shadow, vague and indistinct. But it was there. Ben's heart skipped a beat, and he nearly tripped on the treadmill. He caught himself and looked again, but the figure was gone. He stopped the treadmill, his pulse racing. He knew he'd seen something, someone. But the gym was empty, as always. The only sound was the hum of the lights, the whir of the treadmill's belt slowing to a stop. Ben stood there for a moment, trying to calm his nerves. "It's just your imagination," he told himself. "You're tired, and your mind's playing tricks on you." But the feeling of being watched was now impossible to ignore. He decided to cut his workout short. He grabbed his towel and wiped the sweat from his face, glancing nervously at the mirrors as he did so. The reflection was normal, just him, alone in the gym. But the shadows seemed to shift in the corners, as if something was moving just out of sight. As Ben walked toward the locker room to grab his bag, he heard it. A faint noise, like the sound of something dragging across the floor. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound came again, closer this time, a soft, scraping noise that echoed through the silent gym. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room. There, in the far corner near the free weights, the shadows seemed to thicken, coalescing into a darker shape. The air grew colder, and Ben could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The shadowy figure began to take form, emerging from the darkness like something crawling out of a nightmare. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Ben couldn't make out any details. No face, no features, just a black silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. Fear gripped Ben as the figure started to move, slowly gliding toward him. The dragging noise grew louder, like nails scraping across the floor. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place. The figure stopped a few feet away from him, its head still tilted as if it were studying him. The shadows around it pulsed, and Ben could feel a cold, suffocating presence pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Then the figure spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a shock of terror through Ben, breaking the paralysis that had gripped him. He turned and bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his ears. The gym seemed to stretch out before him, the exit impossibly far away. As he ran, he could hear the dragging sound behind him, getting closer, faster. The cold presence followed him, the shadows at the edge of his vision seeming to reach out, trying to grab him, pull him back. He reached the door and slammed into it, fumbling with the handle. The dragging noise was right behind him now, the cold pressing against his back. With a final desperate push, he yanked the door open and stumbled outside, the humid night air hitting him like a wall. Ben didn't stop running until he reached his car. He threw open the door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut, locking it behind him. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, he peeled out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. He drove home in a daze, his mind racing. What had he seen? A trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But deep down, he knew it was something more, something real, something malevolent. For the next few days, Ben tried to convince himself that it had all been in his head. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened, didn't want to sound crazy, but the experience haunted him. He started having nightmares about the shadowy figure, about the dragging sound that seemed to echo in his mind even when he was awake. Despite his fear, Ben knew he couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, control his life. He decided to go back to the gym, but this time he would go during the day, when the place was busy and filled with people. He told himself that if he could face it, maybe it would lose its power over him. A few days later, on a bright Saturday morning, Ben returned to the gym. The parking lot was full, and the gym was bustling with activity. The sunlight streaming through the windows made the place feel warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere he had experienced that night. Ben walked through his workout routine, trying to ignore the nagging fear at the back of his mind. Everything seemed normal. There were no shadows, no strange noises, no sense of being watched. He began to relax, thinking that maybe it had all been a bad dream after all. But as he was finishing up on the treadmill, something caught his eye. In the mirrored wall in front of him, he saw a figure standing near the squat rack. A tall, thin figure with limbs that were too long, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. The gym was full of people, but no one else seemed to notice it. Ben's heart began to race. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. But the fear that had gripped him that night returned with full force. He quickly grabbed his bag and headed for the exit, his mind reeling. As he passed the front desk, the attendant, a young woman who had just started working there, gave him a curious look. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing the panic in his eyes. Ben hesitated, then shook his head. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well last night." She nodded sympathetically. "Well, if you need anything, just let us know." He mumbled a quick thanks and hurried out the door. As he walked to his car, he felt that same cold presence creeping up on him, but when he looked around, the parking lot was empty. For the next few nights, Ben avoided the gym entirely, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The nightmares continued, growing more vivid and terrifying with each passing night. The figure would appear in the shadows, always just out of reach, whispering in that same low, guttural voice. One night, as Ben lay in bed, the dream took a different turn. The figure was there, standing at the foot of his bed, but this time, it didn't speak. It just stood there, its hollow eyes watching him, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. Ben couldn't move, couldn't scream, as the figure reached out with one of its long, shadowy arms and touched his chest. The cold was overwhelming, suffocating, and Ben felt his heart begin to slow, his breath catching in his throat. The figure's touch was like ice, seeping into his bones, draining the life out of him. With a sudden jolt, Ben woke up, gasping for air. His heart was pounding, and his body was drenched in sweat. but the cold presence was still there, lingering in the room, and he could still feel the icy touch on his chest. Desperate for answers, Ben decided to do some research on the gym. He spent hours online, digging through old articles and forums, looking for anything that might explain what he had experienced. What he found only deepened his fear. The gym, it turned out, had a dark history. Years ago, before it had been converted into a fitness center, the building had been used as a storage facility. There were rumors that a man, an employee, had been killed there in a freak accident. The details were hazy, but some said he had been crushed by falling equipment, while others claimed he had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. The most unsettling part was that the man's death had never been fully explained, and his body had been discovered by a coworker who described seeing a dark, shadowy figure standing over him before it vanished into thin air. Ben's blood ran cold as he read the accounts. The descriptions matched what he had seen: the tall, thin figure, the unnatural posture, the feeling of cold and dread. He realized with growing horror that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was tied to that place. As the days went by, Ben's fear began to consume him. He started seeing the figure everywhere, in the reflections of windows, in the shadows of his apartment, even in his peripheral vision as he walked down the street. It was always there, always watching, and the cold presence followed him like a curse. Finally, one night, unable to take it anymore, Ben decided to confront the thing. He knew it was insane, but he was desperate. He drove to the gym in the middle of the night, the parking lot empty and the lights inside flickering ominously. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The gym was silent, the air cold and thick with the smell of dust and sweat. He walked slowly through the empty room, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he approached the squat rack, he heard it, the faint, dragging sound that had haunted him since that first night. The shadows in the corner began to shift, coalescing into the dark figure that had terrorized him for weeks. Ben's heart raced, but he forced himself to stand his ground. The figure emerged from the shadows, its long limbs moving with that same unnatural grace. Its head tilted as it studied him, and Ben could feel the cold presence pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. "Why are you here?" Ben demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on Ben, its twisted smile stretching wider. The cold intensified, and Ben felt the same suffocating sensation he had experienced in his dreams. With a surge of fear-fueled adrenaline, Ben grabbed the nearest weight and hurled it at the figure. It passed through the shadowy form and clanged against the wall, the sound echoing through the empty gym. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it began to move toward Ben, its steps slow and deliberate, the dragging sound growing louder with each step. Ben backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, but the figure was relentless, closing the distance between them. The lights flickered, and for a moment the gym was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure was right in front of Ben, its cold, shadowy hand reaching out to touch him. Ben screamed as the icy fingers made contact with his chest, the cold seeping into his body, freezing him from the inside out. The figure's grip tightened, and Ben felt his heart begin to slow, his vision blurring as the cold consumed him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the figure's twisted, smiling face, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. When the gym opened the next morning, the staff found Ben's lifeless body lying near the squat rack. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his skin pale and cold to the touch. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but those who examined the body couldn't explain the unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from his chest. The gym was shut down for a few days following Ben's death, and the staff and members were interviewed by the police. But no one could explain what had happened to him, and the case was eventually closed. After the gym reopened, the rumors started. People began to talk about the strange occurrences that had been happening late at night. The flickering lights, the cold drafts, the faint sound of something dragging across the floor. Some claimed to have seen a dark figure standing in the shadows, watching them with hollow eyes. Membership began to decline as more and more people reported feeling uneasy in the gym, especially at night. The staff tried to reassure everyone that the place was safe, but the stories persisted, and eventually, the gym was forced to close its doors for good. The building now stands empty, a dark, abandoned shell of what it once was. But those who pass by it at night still speak of the cold presence that lingers there, and the shadowy figure that can sometimes be seen in the windows, watching, waiting. And those who dare to enter the building after dark, if only on a dare, often find themselves overwhelmed by a suffocating cold and the sound of something dragging across the floor, getting closer and closer until it's right behind them. The gym remained closed, its doors padlocked and its windows boarded up, but the rumors never died down. If anything, they grew more intense as time passed. Teenagers dared each other to break in, and some claimed to have seen the shadowy figure through the cracks in the boards, its hollow eyes watching from the darkness. Despite these stories, no one had the courage to stay inside for more than a few minutes, until one fateful night, a group of local high school students, bored and looking for a thrill, decided to investigate the abandoned gym. They had heard the stories, but none of them believed in ghosts or curses. It was just an old building, they told themselves, and they were determined to prove it. There were 4 of them. Mark, the ringleader, always eager for adventure. Lisa, his girlfriend, who was more reluctant but didn't want to seem scared. Ryan, the skeptic, who scoffed at the idea of anything supernatural. And Sarah, the quiet one, who had a bad feeling about the whole thing but didn't want to be left out. They arrived at the gym around midnight, the only light coming from the dim street lamp at the end of the block. The building loomed in front of them, its once bright facade now dark and foreboding. The air was thick with the scent of damp and decay, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the boards, making the building seem almost alive. Mark, holding a flashlight, led the way as they approached the side door. The padlock had been broken, probably by some other group of thrill seekers, and the door hung slightly ajar. Mark pushed it open, and the group stepped inside. The air inside the gym was stale and cold, much colder than it should have been for a summer night. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space as they made their way through the gym, the flashlight beam dancing across the dusty floor and rusting equipment. "Creepy," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She clung to Mark's arm, her eyes darting around the darkened room. "It's just an old building," Ryan said dismissively, though he couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine. "There's nothing here." Sarah stayed close to the group, her eyes wide as she scanned the shadows. She had the unsettling feeling that they were being watched, but every time she looked around, there was nothing but darkness. As they ventured deeper into the gym, the atmosphere grew heavier, the cold more intense. Mark's flashlight began to flicker, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The gym was eerily silent, except for the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak of the old building settling. They reached the center of the gym, near the squat rack where Ben had been found. The air was even colder here, and Sarah noticed a faint metallic smell that made her stomach churn. "Let's take a look around," Mark suggested, trying to keep the bravado in his voice. "See if we can find anything interesting." As they spread out, Mark's flashlight flickered again, and then went out completely. The gym was plunged into darkness, and the group froze, their breath catching in their throats. "Great," Ryan muttered, pulling out his phone to use the flashlight. But as he turned it on, the light barely pierced the thick darkness, as if the shadows were swallowing it whole. "Let's just go," Lisa whispered, her voice filled with fear. "This place gives me the creeps." "Yeah, maybe we should," Mark began. But he was cut off by a sound that sent a chill through all of them. It was the sound of something dragging across the floor, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. The noise echoed through the gym, the cold intensifying with each passing second. "What the hell is that?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling now. The dragging sound grew louder, and then they saw it. A shadowy figure emerging from the darkness near the heavy bags. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at that same odd angle. The figure seemed to glide across the floor, the dragging sound accompanying its every movement. Lisa let out a small scream and backed away, but her legs felt like lead. Mark's bravado evaporated, replaced by pure terror. Ryan dropped his phone, the light flickering out as it hit the ground. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her toward the door. The group scrambled to follow, their panic-fueled footsteps echoing through the gym. But the shadowy figure was faster than they were. It moved with an unnatural speed, cutting off their escape route. The dragging sound was deafening now, the cold so intense that it burned their skin. Sarah felt something brush against her arm, cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The figure was right in front of her now, its hollow eyes staring into her soul, its twisted smile growing wider and wider. "No!" she cried, backing away, but the figure reached out with one of its long, shadowy arms, its touch freezing her in place. Mark and Lisa were at the door, desperately trying to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The cold seemed to seep into their bones, sapping their strength. Ryan stood frozen in the middle of the gym, his eyes wide with terror as the figure turned its gaze on him. "Get away from us!" Mark shouted, his voice breaking as he pounded on the door. But the figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching them with those empty, lifeless eyes. And then the figure began to change. The shadows around it thickened, twisting and writhing like living things. The cold grew unbearable, and the metallic smell became overwhelming, filling the gym with the stench of decay. The figure's face twisted into something monstrous, its grin stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and the dragging sound became a low, rumbling growl. Sarah felt the figure's cold fingers wrap around her wrist, and the last thing she saw was the twisted, grinning face before everything went black. The next morning, the police were called to the gym after a passerby noticed the side door hanging open. Inside, they found 4 teenagers lying on the gym floor, their faces pale and contorted in expressions of sheer terror. There were no signs of struggle, no marks on their bodies, and no cause of death that the coroner could determine. It was as if their hearts had simply stopped out of fear. The gym was condemned and eventually demolished, but the stories didn't stop. People claimed that the land itself was cursed, that the shadowy figure still haunted the area where the gym once stood. On cold, foggy nights, passers-by would sometimes hear the faint sound of something dragging across the ground, or catch a glimpse of a dark figure with hollow eyes, watching from the shadows. And those who were brave, or foolish, enough to venture too close to the old gym's location, often found themselves overwhelmed by an inexplicable cold, a suffocating darkness that seemed to close in around them, and the sound of a low, guttural growl that echoed in their minds long after they had fled. Thank you for listening. Now watch this video.